there will be one defining issue for the European Union over the next 2 years, and that's the energy crisis. And the reality is this is such a serious matter that it will overshadow all other policy initiatives.
Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta Podcast. I'm your host today, Andrea Christianson. I'm excited to welcome our two guests to the show today, John Hume and Chris Mehigan. John and Chris join us from Hume Brophy, a leading global communication firm headquartered in Dublin that helps clients navigate complex regulatory and political environments. John is the founding director of Hume Brophy, and Chris is a managing director of transport and mobility practice. Both are experts in European business and regulatory issues, and we're excited to welcome them to our in-house podcast studio today. John, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Awesome. So let's start really quick with a burning question. What's going on in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people are asking that question at the moment because I'm not sure a lot of people know. We've had the Bank of England intervene in the markets twice in the last 10 days. Gilt prices are at an all-time low. We've had mini budgets with very, very, clear taxation announcements, which then 5 days later get completely revoked. This really isn't how grown-up governments are supposed to act. So it is a mystery. But what is going on? I think we've got a new government. They've got very, very particular ideas about how the UK should evolve and ideas about where the UK should sit on the world stage and fiscal policy and things like this. But it's a fascinating time, and I don't think I've ever seen, and I've been an avid watcher of UK politics all my life. I've never seen a new government get it so wrong so quickly.
Are they going to recover?
The financial turmoil is still there. I think the energy crisis is making matters worse. Inflation is runaway levels. Will they recover? I'm not sure. I mean, because of the nature of parliamentary democracy in the UK, the Conservative Party have a majority, and I think that won't disappear overnight. So I don't think there's any immediate possibility of an election. However, will the current administration remain in its current form? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, certainly. I think that they've definitely had a very stuttering start. It's not ideal, not what they would have wanted, but they've got very significant hurdles that they've got to cross in the coming weeks as well, not least of which, of course, all eyes are on the budget, which has been brought forward. So the coming weeks and even months will really determine, how far this administration is going to go.
All right. Well, let's turn to the other major UK issue, which is Brexit, which finally formally started in 2020. So now that it's a reality, what has been the immediate impact in the UK and also on the EU?
Well, I suppose when the UK government says we've got Brexit done, they're actually not telling the truth because they haven't got Brexit done. There's large parts of Brexit that still need resolved. For example, the issue I suppose very close to my heart, which is the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And, that is still work in progress. And it is a significant issue which still needs to be resolved. Now, thankfully, now that the Prime Minister is in place and she no longer has to play to the gallery, the language coming from the UK government has improved significantly. And I would think there's real hope and expectation that the Northern Ireland issue will be resolved with a little bit of goodwill on both sides in the coming weeks. Once that's done, I mean, what has been the major impact of Brexit? Well, it depends what world you live in. We've seen in the financial services world, we've seen significant outflows of companies from the City of London. In the television world, we've seen the same thing because they can no longer service their clients in mainland Europe properly from the UK. But overall, I think to people in the UK, it hasn't really made that much of a difference. Politically, obviously, it's a big deal. What we will see in the next year, I think, it was announced last week by Jacob Rees-Mogg, is what they described as the bonfire of the regulations during that they're going to rid the UK of unwanted EU legislation. And I think what they plan to do is to remove all legislation which has its origins in EU law, and then basically keep the ones that they like, amend the ones that they don't, that need amending, and remove the ones that they want to remove. How much can they do this? I mean, it remains to be seen. But I think they cannot completely change everything, because the UK is, whilst it may have left the European Union, it's still part of Europe. The single market is still their biggest trading partner, and therefore they can't radically change the regulatory system.
Yeah, and I would say as well, I think there's still a sense, as to come back to John's point there about how they have not left Europe, they left the European Union. There are very significant trade and cultural links that still exist between the United Kingdom and certain member states where historically there's very strong cooperation and trade. And those relationships, they endure and they continue. And while the UK at the moment is continuing to seek to define itself as not the EU and to find its place on the international stage, they're not doing that in partnership with those countries close by that they have those strong trade links with. So there's still a lot of concern from the European side in terms of where this is going to go and what impact that will have on those European economies.
Yeah, and we were all at a breakfast earlier, and John and Chris have been very generous with their time this morning. And you mentioned that collaboration between the UK and the EU is at an all-time low. Outside of Russia sanctions and aid to Ukraine, there's really not a lot of collaboration. So is that bad? What's the path forward?
I think it is. It is bad, and it's something that we really need to see addressed quite urgently. Both the European Union and the UK would be very well served by working closer together and working in terms of common purpose, and understanding the fact that the economies of both and the livelihood of both are very much intertwined and very much interlinked, and will remain so because the geographical nature of the situation, that they are part of that region of the world and we trade together. So it's important that they do work together as much as possible. If we are going to see significant divergence between the UK and the EU in terms of standards, in terms of certification, in terms of legislation, how it applies and so forth, these are going to create barriers and obstructions to business. And it's going to create a more difficult environment for companies to operate within both. And that is going to have an impact. There's no two ways about it, both for the EU and for the UK as well in terms of market access.
Yeah, looking into a crystal ball, once the Irish question, which has been very contentious, is out of the way, and hopefully that'll happen soon, I think what you will see by necessity is the UK government getting closer to Europe. Because for all the reasons that Chris has just outlined, it is absolutely essential for UK business. Their main marketplace is the European Union, and on a human level, lots of British people live in Ireland, live in France, live in Spain, and lots of European people live in Britain. And that's just life, And I think that will. I hope encourage the government to that they do need to have good neighbourly relationships with the European governments and the EU.
You mentioned earlier that the UK is going to go through this process of throwing out all of the EU rules and adopt some, amend some, readopt some, keep others out. How is this process going to impact their ability to trade with the EU?
Well, yeah, I suppose one thing to think on that is that the first thing is that it's this old adage of, how do you unscramble an egg, So you've all this legislation mixed in. If they start removing elements of this and sunsetting that legislation, what are the knock-on effects and what is the impact if we remove one? It's kind of like, you have this house of cards and you pull away one card and the whole thing could collapse. So from an industry perspective, industries need to really think about this and understand what is the implication for my business if this piece of legislation that originates from the EU is removed, from the mix in the UK, and how will that impact on their strategy and on their investments and so forth? That is a really, really big question. The other side of this, though, is the question is, what is the point of this and where is it going? How does this benefit, the UK and businesses that are operating in the UK, and other than just to say we're removing EU legislation, because the UK, again, proximity and market relations, they're besides the largest market in the world, 500 million consumers in the European single market. And that has weight, that has influence. We already know for a fact that any company that's operating in the UK, regardless of the standards and certifications and laws that are applied by the UK, if that company wants to trade with the European Union, they're going to have to adhere to European standards. So we can remove, the UK can remove all these elements, but for any company that's based in the UK looking to deal with the EU, they're still going to be subject to them. So where is the benefit from this?
And the UK itself is a small market in relative terms, with only 60 million people, compared to the European Union with over 500 million consumers. So therefore, removing regulations are fine for a domestic business, but for those that trade internationally, and a lot of companies see the UK, and it is very much their sort of from where they trade with the EU. Removing all these regulations, I don't really know what ultimately what purpose it would serve. I mean, what Jacob Rees-Mogg said is he wants the UK to become the best regulated country in the world, which is very laudable, of course, and sort of what a responsible minister should say, I would imagine. But the reality is, the UK lives in a much wider, interdependent, international, globalized world where, and their main market is Europe. I mean, the UK does more trade with Ireland, a market of 4 million people, than it does with India, for example.
That's significant. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to start talking about the energy crisis.
Every 2 weeks, Penta measures U.S. adults' feelings and expectations toward the economy. The Civic Science Economic Sentiment Index, powered by Penta, accurately measures movements in overall national economic sentiment and provides a more sophisticated alternative to existing economic sentiment indices. To learn more, contact us at pentagroup.co.
Welcome back to What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. This is your host, Andrea Christianson. I'm here with John Hume and Chris Mehigan from global communications firm Hume Brophy. And we've been talking about UK, EU policy, and we're about to start talking about kind of what's on top of mind for everyone in Europe right now, which is winter is coming. There is an energy crisis at foot. And so my question to you both is, what are some of the long-term political and policy implications of what's coming this winter?
Well, I think the current crisis has shown that the EU, or certainly a number of member states, or most member states, they got their energy policy wrong. They neglected energy security, and now that is going to create a big problem. And I think how the European Union and how key countries react to this will, I think, be the defining feature of the next couple of years in Europe. The reality is that, this is a very serious problem. There is not enough energy in Europe, and the costs are skyrocketing. The cost of heating a home in certain countries has doubled, if not tripled. Things like this have serious political impacts. And therefore, from what we can see in Europe at the moment, the focus is very much about getting through this winter and next winter. And it's that immediate challenge of how do we keep, major industrial installations working? How do we keep factories working? How do we keep people being able to heat their homes? These are real issues now that need to be addressed immediately. And there are no easy solutions here. And I think this problem has been further exaggerated by the decision taken by OPEC last Friday to further cut oil production. So I think whilst the European Union has been very much focused on a sustainable future and on renewable energy, and there is now very much a sort of how do we deal with the here and now.
Well, and one of our guests at the breakfast this morning noted that, Europe's buying more coal than they've bought in 30 years. So how does the realities of people needing to heat their homes impact some of these broader sustainability objectives that many governments in the EU writ large has adopted?
Yeah, well, as an Irish person, we love talking about the weather, right? But this year, that as we head into winter, that's extremely important. If the weather is particularly cold or bad this year, it is going to put additional pressure on member states and on the governments in terms of their requirements around energy and heating in particular. But in terms of what we have seen, of course, is that the energy security question has been catapulted to the very, very top of the political priorities list in Europe, and that's across the board. While we don't know where the final outcome will be and what this will look like at the end of the day, what we can say with great certainty is that the energy mix that existed in February 2022 and how Europe worked, that is no longer going to work, and we will not be going back to that model. And so now there is a shift towards a new approach towards energy within the EU. The political priority, of course, is about keeping the lights on. And so if that means, for example, that sustainability goals may have to take a little bit of a back step in the immediate term to address the crisis, well, then that might be the cost that has to be paid in order to get us across there. But it also creates significant opportunities as well, because we are going to have to, redesign our approach to energy in Europe. And we need to, draw upon innovation. We need to draw upon new technologies. We need to look at, a new approach to this, a new way of working together in terms of energy. And that does create very significant opportunities for industries.
And what might that look like? And is there any government or industry leading the way right now?
Well, there is, but obviously the key focus here, because, it's much like what we've seen before, is that, we acknowledge that there's an importance in diversifying our energy mix. But the key here as well is that in longer term thinking, we need to be focusing more so on renewables. So we are going to see, I think, greater investment in that space. I think a greater priority in terms of the planning applications and making sure they go through. So maybe a degree of less governments paying less heed to concerns around sort of, not in my backyard sort of approach that, why is that windmill, looking down my window? The windmill is straight outside your window now because of the necessity of what we're doing, So I think there's probably going to be a bit of a shift in that regard. But yeah, there is a very clear priority here. And of course, if we are going to do this in line with the sustainability goals, then that's where we have to head towards.
Yeah, well, need is the mother of necessity, or necessity is the mother of invention. Thank you. And so talking about sustainability, you both have done a lot of work in the transportation sector. I'd be curious what you see as the future of transportation, whether it be aviation, automotive, how the sustainability goals and the ESG goals are working in that industry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion to be in at the moment. And I have to say, and I've worked in transport policy for over 12 years now, and it is right now we're at the cusp of something really quite amazing. It's a very exciting and dynamic time. Transport is rightly identified as a cause of significant emissions from a sustainability perspective, but you can flip that coin as well, and you can say, well, transport is also part of the solution when we think about sustainability and we think about societies and how they function, and to making sure that we can have this work. We can't get to a sustainable society without sustainable transport existing within that function somewhere. And so that is creating, again, huge opportunity for an awful lot of industries to be part of that process and that priority where we have to decarbonize and come to a sustainable transport model across the various modes. And there's new technologies being introduced and explored, and that in itself is opening up all sorts of very interesting developments. We've seen, of course, the big discussion both in the US and in the European Union over the last couple of years has been around sustainable aviation fuels. And there's been very significant progress been made there by both regions. But now we're looking at what comes next. We're looking at electric, we're looking at hydrogen. And hydrogen is a really fascinating one in terms of how that's going to fit within the mix and what opportunities that presents as well. And Europe is really leaning into that very, very strongly. They've got a very clear plan about what they want to achieve. They see how it can work in. They've identified that hard to decarbonize industries such as maritime and aviation, these are going to be sectors that they're going to lean towards in terms of hydrogen use.
Okay, so let's turn to EU leadership more broadly. We've seen the EU kind of take the lead on a lot of major regulations, including GDPR. They're leading on ESG efforts. How should we think about EU leadership here? And more specifically, how should multinational companies think about the regulations and the policies that are coming out of the EU as they sort of develop how they're engaging across the world?
If you take the ESG debate in the EU, it is quite interesting how the European Commission have changed how they do things. What you have seen is the European Commission, while still the regulator and the legislator, has also become an activist. And what you've seen is that the European Commission is basically pointing the finger at industries that aren't doing what they should be doing and asking why. And then turning to their investors, their financiers, and indeed their customers and saying, why are you still doing business with these people? And this, the market reacts a lot faster than the regulator. And, the results that they've been getting have been a lot quicker and a lot more effective than the regulatory change, which always takes a much longer. So I think, certainly on ESG, I think you will see in the future much more activism from the EU, and I think the debate will move a lot quicker and be a lot more decisive than regulatory change. And I think that is something that, all corporations and businesses, that do business and that operate in the EU need to be very mindful of.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I find the ESG debate in Europe is really fascinating, because it's a new way for them to bring forward policy, but to cultivate behavioural change in organisations. Which is, to me, is quite fascinating. And there's a clear distinction between the likes of GDPR, which is setting very hard and fast rules. It's hard legislation. It says if you are going to deal with the personal data of European residents, these are the rules you will follow, and we will hold you to those, But with the ESG side, it's a little bit different. It's more sort of saying, if you are to, get access to the single market and to be able to, so forth and all the rest, then here are some behaviours which we encourage. And if you do this, then you're going to be identified as an eco-label, provided the eco-label for your company, and that's going to give you opportunities for funding and so forth and all the rest. So it's much more, it's a softer sort of approach, but nonetheless, it's very impactful. And really what fascinates me about that whole process is, rather than going down the hard approach of GDPR, it's about harnessing social power and social pressure onto companies and onto industries. And that is a fascinating sort of development that they've gone in that direction,
Yeah, that is fascinating. And what, that balance between hard and soft, what other areas do you think might fall into those kind of categories?
This is, again, when we look back on this and we see that this is not in isolation. This is a trend we can look at through various, legislative developments in the EU over the last number of years. And it all stems from the fact that they have perhaps are woken up to the power of the single market and the influence that the single market can drive forward. They can set standards internationally, whether that's the type of charger you're going to have on your phone in the future, or whether it's about how you deal with data protection and privacy or cybersecurity requirements, And again, cybersecurity is another very good one as well that is going to apply. So even if you're based outside of the EU but providing a service in, and it's a particular networked infrastructure service, then you are going to be subject to the cybersecurity requirements, So there's how they're moving forward is they clearly have come to an understanding of the influence that they can play internationally when it comes to driving forward legislation and, as I say, cultivating behaviours with companies. And that's really going to be amplified even more so now, because we've only touched on the E part of ESG, on the environmental aspect, and that we can talk about things in terms of the levels of emissions from businesses and so forth, about their energy mix and so on, their investments. But when we get into the social and the governance aspect of this discussion, about rules around labour laws and so forth, about working times and all the rest, what impact will those have in terms of businesses providing access in? And it's a huge departure from many, many years of a very open approach to allowing access to the market that Europe has taken. And now it's much more in control and determining the rules by which companies are going to access the single market.
Yeah, and talking a little bit about what's next, John, you mentioned earlier that When it comes to influencing EU policy, the early bird gets the worm. So what are the emerging issues that aren't in the headlines today that global companies should be thinking about starting to engage the EU on today?
As I see it, there will be one defining issue for the European Union over the next 2 years, and that's the energy crisis. And the reality is this is such a serious matter that it will overshadow all other policy initiatives. And, I think when you look at their attitude towards energy, there is the short term, which is the next 2 winters, and then there is the long term. And I think what you're going to see is a massive, massive, massive investment in renewable energy, the likes of which has never been seen before by the European Union, because they have to. And as you said, necessity is the mother of invention. And that's where I think, the real focus will be. Outside of that, I think, how Europe does business is changing. The UK leaving has had an impact in Europe as well, in that sort of, the UK was always in many ways the problem child, who would have been against further integration. I think by necessity now, given the crises that we are facing, integration will become an issue of the future. That said, there are populist governments appearing across the European Union, and the political fallout of the energy crisis could be quite serious in that, if people can't, heat their homes, they're not happy. If people can't go to work, they're not happy. And that could have all sorts of repercussions down the line. So I think what we're looking, at the next couple of years, it will be a bumpy ride for Europe. But again, I think there's Europe survives crises. The European Union is there in order to sort of deal with these things, and I think the institutions, will ensure that sort of, that things will go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, though, I think in terms of a couple of areas that I would, and I agree entirely in terms of the energy crisis, that's what's going to be the focus in the immediate to short term. But beyond that, again, we can't get away from the overarching priorities around sustainability. And sustainability is going to remain the big topic. And in many ways, the solutions that we look for in terms of the energy crisis are going to be, also trying to tick the box in terms of moving forward in terms of our sustainability goals. I think the other thing, I suppose, to be conscious of is that Europe is not afraid of innovation and is really leading in very, very heavily in that regard. And they are leading in a couple of areas on this, do you know what I mean? In terms of certain new technologies coming forward, Europe are at the absolute forefront in terms of regulation for them. But an area which is well identified as presenting a huge opportunity, but they are also very wary of it as well, and they're approaching it with a caution, and they're establishing how to do things, and they use particular language, and this is in the space of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, of course, opens up many, many, many opportunities for all sorts of industries across the board. Really, it's quite boundless. But Europe are approaching and saying, the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is going through the process at the moment, is going to be adopted and so forth. It is very clear they're saying, we will facilitate, we will allow the development of an artificial intelligence, activity and around businesses in Europe, but it'll be subject to European values. And those European values, that was something which we started to see that language more and more in some of the policy documents, and you can start to put a pin in it and identify what it is. And it's very clear that there are certain aspects in there. We go back to GDPR, for example, in terms of the use of data and privacy and so forth. These are European values, and so those European values are being baked into legislation. So it's a very clear, on the one hand, they're quite happy to legislate for artificial intelligence and to allow companies to go down that route. But again, they are going to control how that works.
Well, you have given us a lot to think about. Thank you, John and Chris. We really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you for listening to this edition of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. Tune in next week and visit us at pentagroup.co to learn more.